Let's talk with Dr. Steve Turley, PhD, author of the new book, Fight, How Trump and the MAGA Movement Are Changing the World. He's done like 20 books now. You'll find plenty of his stuff up on Amazon, and recently came across each other. So welcome to What's Bugging Me, Steve. Appreciate your being here.
No, Dennis, it's my honor. Thank you so much for having me.
So about your new book, the thing I like is it's got the MAGA spirit to it, and you clearly are, I think, enthusiastic about it and probably a supporter of it, although that's not clear in the text as you read it. But it takes a global, historical, academic, and intellectual view of how we got here. And I kind of find from looking at it that Trump didn't invent this movement, though he did surf on this wave that was kind of swelling up for years before all over the world. Why don't you start there for us?
Yeah, that's a great intro, actually. It's really good. That's why I wrote the book. I was hearing this common misconception about Trump and the MAGA movement on both the left and the right, interestingly enough, but in different forms. And that's this notion that the MAGA movement is something that's very specific to Trump and something very specific to America. In other words, if you didn't have a place called America, you wouldn't have Trump and the MAGA movement, right? And of course, this is certainly understandable. The slogan is, after all, make America great again. It's Trump's slogan, replete with, red hats and the like. Sure, no question. But I think what's so fascinating is if we just take a few steps back, we'll find that there are people all over the world that are involved in virtually identical movements, particularly in Europe and Latin America. So the same year that Trump first ran back in 2016, you had Brexit, the Brexit referendum that passed on June 23rd. And Brexit was animated by almost exactly the same concerns as MAGA: national sovereignty, economic sovereignty, cultural sovereignty. At
Borders.
The same time, yes, yeah. And at the same time, you're seeing almost the exact same kind of political realignment happening among Britain's working class that largely defected from their Labour Party's position of remaining in the EU to vote again. They ended up turning around and voting against it. You had Boris Johnson even say that Brexit would make Britain great again. But you had comparable dynamics surrounding the rise of Marine Le Pen in France, Giorgia Meloni in Italy. Viktor Orban wants to mega. He wants to make Europe great again, the prime minister of Hungary. You had the farmers' revolt in the Netherlands, the Yellow Vest uprising in France.
And this is not inspired by Trump. This is instead all part of a much broader movement of which Trump is only a part.
That's it. It's exactly right. And then when you push that and you say, why is this going on all over the world? It's because what they all have in common is that this is a real, very visceral backlash against globalization. And because globalism is everywhere, the backlash, as it were, is everywhere. And so that's why we're seeing movements that are very unique. They're their own thing, but they also have tremendous amount in common in terms of their concerns about border security, economic security, cultural security, and the like.
Now, you say globalism, but let's define that, because when I think of globalism, what I mean is global trade, which is a good thing. A huge part of the world, I think it's 1/3 of at least of the poverty in the world went above the poverty line because of global trade, because they could get more work, etc. So that's not what we're talking about. I don't think if we stopped having global trade that suddenly the world would be a better place. So tell us what you mean by globalism then.
Yeah, it's a great that's a great opportunity to make a distinction. I like to make a distinction between globalism or globalization as a servant and globalization as a master. So you and I were talking about before the interview. My wife is actually from Japan, and so I like the fact that we have modern travel and that our nations are open up to each other and the like. Globalism as a servant is a wonderful thing. What everyone seems to be rising up against is this notion of globalism as a master.
Yes, the European Commission telling me what the specs should be on my toaster.
There you go. The
World Economic Forum version of globalism, which is where let's have a whole reset and everyone should do things the way we say.
We have today a technology and a telecommunication ability that has amassed a tremendous amount of power and wealth in the hands of very, very few people. And they are using that technology and telecommunications to enforce their values, their interests, their concerns on a mass population. And when that mass population says, we'd like to have a little bit of a say on what happens, they're in effect told to shut up. That's what wokeness is. Wokeness is an ideology that's imposed from the top down that in effect disallows for any dissent whatsoever. Dissent is actually treated like a heresy, and heretics
shut up, you're racist. That's racist,
exactly. Well, and that's identity politics. Identity politics are a very important part of minimizing the moral restraints that unique cultures and customs and traditions have. It's technically called a de-traditionalist dynamic in globalism. So wherever globalism becomes a master, the unique cultures, customs, and traditions of the people are sidelined now. They're actually denigrated as bigoted and racist and all kinds of phobic, so as to supposedly liberate sovereign individuals to become full members of a global society. And when we say full members, we mean workers and consumers. And that's it. Right. That's the only future you have in a WEF world or a Brussels world or adults in DC world. You're a consumer and a worker, and that's it.
Yeah, there's a related theme that comes up in your new book, Fight, and that is that liberalism is dead. Liberalism. We're now into this new phase that's called neo-feudalism, and that's when you talk about that wealth separation and those billionaires. But you say liberalism is dead and that liberals themselves killed it. And by this way, let's understand that Steve writes liberalism predicated on limiting executive power while maximizing individual freedom. That form of liberalism has died. And Dr. Turley says in his book, it's not Donald Trump and the MAGA movement that are threats to liberalism. The irony is that no one has undermined liberalism's foundational principles more than liberals themselves. Take it.
Oh, sing it. Oh, I love it. Because to me, this is one of the biggest ironies, because all we hear about is how the Trump and the MAGA movement are such threats to the liberal international order, democracy, whatever. No one has undermined the fundamental tenets of liberalism more than liberals. No, you caught it. It's hard to define liberalism when all's said and done, to be honest, when you go through the literature, because nobody quite agrees as to what liberty is, or to have an objective definition. But generally speaking, scholars root liberalism in those two fundamental tenets that you just talked about: an emphasis on reason over and against religion in all matters of public policy, and the restraint on executive power so as to maximize human freedom. And those go together when you look at the history. Mary Poovey the historian, did a very interesting study on the history of the fact. When did we start citing statistics? And so you notice you read Augustine or Aquinas, and they never say, well, statistics show that. We started doing that in the 19th century, and it was because of scientific rationalism as sort of this one true way of understanding reality that emerged out of the Enlightenment. And then what that did is that it forced our leaders to have to justify their policies using the same laws of logic that the masses were privy to. So they couldn't appeal to some special esoteric knowledge that they had by virtue of their ordination as a prince or as a bishop.
So we're liking this, right? We're liking this. This is a good thing.
This is a good thing. Sure. This is part of the balance of power. This is how classical liberalism started. And it seemed like, okay, a classical liberal society is going to be rational and free. Sounds good. Sign me up. No one has done more to undermine those two tenets than liberals. In the 1960s, in the Academy, the most liberal institution imaginable. It's actually based on German liberal principles in the 19th century. But you saw the advent of what's commonly called postmodernity. And postmodernity basically questioned the notion of objective truth itself, that knowledge itself was something that was purely subjective. So you had, for example, the psychology, Jordan Peterson talks about this all the time, the psychology department saying, well, there are innumerable ways of being able to interpret perception and reality. The literary criticism department said, oh, there's innumerable ways of legitimately interpreting a text. Sociology and cultural anthropology were telling us that all knowledge is social and cultural constructs. And then you have someone like Francois Lyotard, the French sociologist in 1979, finding that went mainstream. Western society now was beginning to question whether there really was a one-size-fits-all way of understanding the world via scientific rationalism. They didn't buy it anymore. They started saying, no, it's more your culture. Your culture determines these things.
You can listen to complete episodes of What's Bugging Me with Dennis Kneale by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.